All right, greetings, fellow nerds, and welcome to Two Nerds versus the Internet. My name is Andrew, and I am the resident nerd and host. Tag along each week as I'm joined by a fellow nerd, and we discuss and debate a wide variety of topics across several fandoms, giving our point of views on why it's the best and why you should agree with us. With that, let me introduce my first guest of the first episode, Tyler.
What's up, nerds?
So, Tyler, welcome to Two Nerds vs. the Internet. How are you doing today?
I'm good, man. Doing well. Thanks for having me on.
So, Tyler, what are we talking about today?
Well, today we are talking about an American icon, someone who is a cornerstone of American culture, and I would argue worldwide culture at this point.
Okay.
Not only is he one
it's
of
a he.
What's that?
It's a he. Okay.
It's a he.
I was thinking it was Lady Liberty, but do go on.
I'm pretty sure they team up once or twice. But yeah, not only is this person a super critical part of American culture and comic books in general, he is the first superhero and the reason we have the entire genre that we do, and probably the reason comic books are still a thing today, and that is Superman.
Superman. All right. So for those of you who've lived under rocks and don't know who Superman is, congratulations, you're going to get to learn a little bit about him. For those of you who do, I'm sure some of this might be a little boring or mundane for you, but we're going to tell you just a little bit about Superman. He was created by two guys, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, released in Action Comics #1 on April 18th of 1938. He's coming up on his 100th birthday in just, 12 years? 13 years? 13 years. That's crazy to think about. Superman will be 100 years old in 13 years.
I know.
Damn. So based on what I've been able to see, and, kind of some of the background information I've got, obviously Action Comics #1 was all about Superman. And a lot of comics at the time, and I'm sure not many people know this, but comic books at the time weren't always about the superheroes we know today. Action Comics didn't feature Superman in every single issue for quite a while. I think it was like issue 19 is, from that point on, it's just Superman. Before that, it bounced between Superman and a couple other characters. From what I saw, you may know a little bit more than me. You are my expert on Superman, so
yeah. There's some details there that I can add on to.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. So what we're talking about here with Action Comics #1, it takes place in what is colloquially referred to as the Golden Age of comics. This is primarily centered around World War II, that era, when comics were being printed like crazy, and they were also selling like crazy. And so that's why it's the Golden Age. It's when they were at their absolute peak from a sales perspective and from a readership perspective. And so you had companies that were just pumping out new types of comics every month to try and fill the newsstands and sell as much as they could.
Well, besides superheroes, what did you have in the comic books at the time?
You had all kinds of stuff. You had horror, you had mystery, you had military. Obviously there's a global war going on. And so you saw comics that would come out and would focus explicitly on stories about soldiers fighting in the war. And superheroes weren't a thing originally, right? You also saw Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck in your comics.
I've got a Donald Duck comic, actually.
Yeah. I mean, imagine, right? It's before TV, right? So that's where you got your cartoons and your, instead of Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon, you went down to the newsstand and you grabbed your comic books.
Oh yeah.
And so they were all kinds of stuff, and you had comedy comics. Obviously, that's where they get their name, comics. And so in the Golden Age in particular, a lot of times what you would see is that they weren't like you would expect today, where you would go down to pick up a book of, say, Superman or The Flash. You would be picking up what today we would call an anthology. It's multiple stories in one that share a theme. And so DC Comics, for example, is named after one of their original anthology books, Detective Comics.
I knew that one.
You would buy your book, and it would have usually it varied from book to book, but the standard was 4 different stories. it would have 4 different detective-based stories.
Right.
And it would be, your Dick Tracy type characters and, maybe even like a proto James Bond kind of person, secret agent guy.
Sure.
And in this case, Detective Comics, obviously Detective Comics 27 would ultimately be the debut of Batman as, the superhero masked detective. And so you had all kinds of stuff. You also had things like More Fun Comics and All American Comics. And one of these that started in 1938 with issue number 1 was Action Comics. Mm-hmm. And right there on the cover, of course, making his debut is Superman, the first superhero ever. And so in this book, obviously, it is like everything else at the time. It's an anthology. And story number 1 is Superman. And with that, there's 3 other stories. And so I would imagine what you were referencing when it wasn't all about Superman, it's because he didn't appear on every cover in the first 20 issues. They tried to emphasize some of the other characters that they had. I can't remember any off the top of my head, but they had some fun stories. They had like one guy was kind of like a safari guy, and he was going through the jungles of Africa, and he would rescue damsels in distress, and everything was very action oriented, and it was those very pulpy stories.
Right.
Some of them, again, because it's action, they had soldiers from the war telling war stories. Or not even war stories. Sometimes it would be like, guys who were explorers but somehow got tangled up in the war and things like that. And so it was a very broad range of things that would come into play. But it became apparent very soon that Superman was the primary draw to that comic. And so once they realized that, they started featuring him on every cover. And it became very well known that if you want to read Superman, Action Comics is the book you do it in.
So let me ask this question, because I know today with comic books, some books release monthly, some books release bi-monthly or every other weekly, whatever phrase you want to use there. I'm pretty certain Action Comics is one of those that does it monthly now. When it was being released, was this one of those, we'll release one every other week? Was this a weekly release? Was this one a month release? What was their release plan at the time? Do you know?
I don't. I believe, I mean, obviously it became monthly eventually, and I think it was for a while. It might have even started that way. I think a lot of these anthology books, they tended to release monthly, and that's because they had different sets of writers and artists for each of the 4 stories. Okay. It wasn't like today where the entire book is one creative team.
Right.
The work was being distributed amongst multiple people who were actually, honestly, like 16, 17-year-olds at the time, a lot of the times. And they were all sharing the workload between writing the stories and doing the artwork. And so they were able to just pump out content like crazy. Say what you will about the quality, but they were pumping out content like crazy. And so you could see things like this easily being a monthly book. And I think it was. Now, then on top of that, you had a lot of other books. Like once Superman gained enough in popularity, they said, well, let's give this guy his own title that's nothing but Superman stories. And that's where Superman Comics started. And again, even though it's all Superman, that was another anthology book. You got 4 Superman stories in every book. And that one, I believe, at least for the first several years, was every other month or maybe even quarterly.
Oh, wow.
You'd have to check me on that, but I know it didn't start out as monthly for quite some time.
Okay. So then is it safe to say that at the time Action Comics was being released, you mentioned a bunch of different writers working on different things. Was it Jerry and Joe were the only ones touching Superman, and that was the only thing they were touching? Or was it possible they were also writing other stories at the same time?
Oh, man, those guys were pumping out all kinds of stuff. In fact, one of my other favorite characters also got his start in the Golden Age. That's the Spectre. He was also a Jerry Siegel creation.
Okay.
So yeah, both of those guys, were, I don't know how many different books they were involved with or how many different stories, but Superman was not exclusive to them, and they were not exclusive to Superman. And in fact, actually, I believe it was Jerry would ultimately end up getting drafted into the Second World War. And so he would stopped working on comics altogether while he went off to help with the war effort. And you would get a whole new batch of creators that would come in, and they were doing all the Superman stuff for a while.
Okay. So that's a little bit about Superman's history. And I think you touched on a couple good things there that would be something fun to explore kind of later, is just the differences in the different ages of comic books. You mentioned the Golden Age. I know just a little bit about that, of like, this was the prime era for when comics were being pumped out, like you said, of all sorts of different types. Maybe not to the same quality or caliber of what we have today. That's a topic for another time. Tell me just a little bit about, how has Superman changed over time? So obviously coming out in 1938, almost 100 years ago, he's had to undergo a couple changes. And in preparation for this, you and I even talked about what are some of the books to recommend, and we'll get there later, but one of the ones you did recommend was Action Comics #1. And I'm not the biggest Superman fan, but I know enough about Superman today, and the average person, you ask him, what can Superman do? They're going to say he can fly, he's got heat vision, he's super fast, he's super strong. Superman of 1938 was fast, was strong, he couldn't fly. He could leap tall buildings in a single bound, he could run as fast as a speeding bullet train, but it's not him versus the Flash like people ask about today.
Yeah.
Still the first superhero, so there's no telling, at what point did his powers change. And again, we can get into that kind of a thing too. But what are some of the biggest changes you as a Superman fan can see? I mean, obviously you've not been reading comic books since 1938. Otherwise, I'd have a lot of other questions for you specifically that we need to discuss separate of this call. But what things can you say, okay, here are the big changes Superman's undergone in the last roughly 100 years?
Yeah, the most obvious one probably is the powers, the way that's evolved over time, right? He started not able to fly, could jump really far, right? You have that whole more powerful than a locomotive, faster than a speeding bullet, able to leap tall buildings in a single bound. And that was kind of the power set for, at least a shockingly short amount of time, actually. It was like 3 issues before they were like, oh yeah, let's give him other powers too, and now he can do... And I think it was within the first couple of years that he had flight and things like that. And so that's probably the most jarring change, is you think of the modern stereotypical set of Superman powers that you see in all the movies and the cartoons, and he didn't have the majority of those in his original appearance, but he started getting them very quickly. What to me is probably the biggest change, though, that you're gonna notice it more as you read, and that's the way they depict his personality. Right? He is now this, like, he's the ultimate good guy, right? He's right up there in the echelons with like Optimus Prime and Captain America. There's a reason his nickname that a lot of the other characters refer to him as is the Big Blue Boy Scout.
He's the Boy Scout.
He's always smiling. He's always happy. He's that, like, the anchor of good within the DC universe, and no matter how bad things get, no matter how dark things get, he's always that bright spot. And that, is pretty different than how he's depicted in this original story. In this story, he's actually pretty brutal.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, they don't outright say he, like, straight up murders people, but he does some stuff that you're like, nope, that guy did not survive.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of modern video games and shows and things like, oh, that person's definitely alive. No, they're not. No, he flew through a building. We don't know. It's possible they're alive. It's possible they're not. No, you're right. That first Action Comics Superman, he didn't really care. He was here to take care of what he thought needed to be taken care of. I can remember the vague details of it is there was a crime spree going on, and they were convicting the wrong woman for a murder, and Superman just shows up to the mob boss's house with the woman who actually committed the murder, and I think he's got her, like, tied up and just throws her on the floor and is like, here's who actually did it. And the mob boss is like, wait, what? And he just busts into the place and he's like, you're going to stop doing what you're doing now.
Yeah.
And everyone's like, okay, because they realize how powerful he is, which is a huge point of Superman today. And even then, he was way more powerful than anyone else. People do fear him a little bit, at least the villains. But like you said, as the Boy Scout, as the perfect icon of happiness and hope for the Justice League today, for the people of not just the United States like he was originally, but of the world, people look to Superman as that icon of hope, and they look to him as the one who's going to save them. And I'm like, that's a good thing for DC Comics, because you made a good point. DC Comics can get dark.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously, their movies can be very dark, and sometimes they're just visually dark and you can't see what's going on the screen. But Superman as a character has always been that beacon of potential hope. And no matter what's going on, and no matter what story I've ever read that either he's the star of or he has a part in, like, for example, recently read Batman Hush, and even though he's in a compromising situation, not going to give away spoilers to anyone who may want to read that story, he's not the main character, but he plays a part in it. Even though he's put in a situation
book or whatever it is.
Hey, listen, we're appealing to the masses. Maybe someone's like, oh, I've never read Hush, I don't want to read that book, and they're going to listen to us talk and go, well, maybe I want to read that book. Despite the situation Superman gets put in, he still is there to save people at the end of the day, because at his core, he knows that's the right thing to do.
Yeah. And that is something that really evolved over time. You start seeing it quite a bit probably in the 50s is when that type of personality starts to take shape, but it's still very hokey, and it's
well, what comic in the 50s wasn't hokey?
Yeah, well, yeah, very, very fair. Yeah, the 50s comics, there's plenty to be said about that.
Yeah.
But he really has become the anchor of really what it means to be a superhero.
Right.
And I think that's partly contributed to the fact that he is the first one, but I think it's also just because people need that and people gravitate to that. And so that it's made him really a timeless character, and like I kind of said when I introduced him, a cornerstone of American culture and an icon worldwide.
Absolutely. So tell me, how did you first start reading and liking Superman? Like, what drew you to him? How did you get into the nerddom or fandom that is Superman?
Well, it all started actually with the cartoons, believe it or not. My first exposure was the Super Friends cartoon, reruns from that playing in the early 90s. And then it would be 96, following Batman the Animated Series, we would get Superman the Animated Series.
Not as good of a series, but still a good series.
Yeah. Well, both great. Both great.
But one's better, but that's fine.
Well, yeah.
We can agree to disagree.
Agree to disagree there, yeah.
Yeah.
But really enjoyed those, and I remember I was with some friends once. We had been at the local rec center playing dodgeball or basketball or something. We were hanging out, and his mom, who was taking us all back home, needed to stop at the local library, and so we all went in and we were looking around, and she was like, because we just lived down the street and she could take it back for me, she was like, all right, everybody can pick one book. And I started walking around, and sure enough, on this rack, they had Superman comics. And I was like, hey, Superman's always been cool. I always loved the cartoons. He was way brighter than Batman, and he didn't have that goofy sidekick that was super lame. Spoiler alert, Robin's actually way cooler than Batman.
Ooh, shots fired. Ouch.
And so, of course,
that's all we have time for today, Tyler. Thanks for your time.
I see how it is.
No, go on. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, so, I mean, I couldn't even tell you what the issue was. It was, library bound and like this plastic binder thing. And so I just grabbed it, not knowing what it was, and took it home, read it in the 20, 30 minutes it took me to read or whatever, and had an absolute blast with it. Thought it was super cool. And of course, immediately wanted more. And so from there, it just kind of turned into this something that I always had an interest in, but didn't know how to seek it out, right? Because nobody
Sure.
that I knew was into comics. My parents didn't know anything about it. And so it was something that kind of went by the wayside until I was in high school.
Wow. Quite a
Early,
difference in age.
yeah, quite a bit. And it was early high school where I got really into the TV show Smallville,
Good
which
show.
I, of course, already really liked Superman. And then watching Smallville on a regular basis every week as new episodes were coming out, and they were pulling in all these aspects of what I didn't realize at the time were little seeds from all of the decades of Superman comic lore.
Right.
And the deeper I got into the show and would follow, forums and blog posts online, and people would start referencing comics, I was like, okay, I've got to find some of these. And finally, I was like, okay, I know what I'm going to do. I saved my weekly allowance for probably 2-3 months at the time. Because, it's not like I had a summer job. I was a bum. I was living off the allowance that my dad would give me. And so I saved it up over weeks, probably even months. And I hunted down the individual floppy issues because I was so new to comics. I had no idea that trade paperbacks were a thing. And I hunted down each of the individual issues of the Death of Superman storyline.
Wow.
And to this day, I have those exact books. I sent them in, got them slabbed and graded, and I have them up on my wall. But those were the first comics that I ever bought and read myself. And from there, the obsession just grew because, of course, I read, what has to be one of the most iconic Superman stories. Certainly one of the most impactful ones. And then, of course, I needed to know what happened next.
Well, of course.
Thankfully, I would discover trade paperbacks and collected editions after that. And so then I began saving up for those, which are much more affordable and much more readily available.
Yes.
And then not long after that, I would realize that DC Comics at the time still offered mailer subscriptions for most of their flagship books. And so then it became kind of an annual thing where, as my birthday and Christmas presents from my parents and my grandparents, they would pay for my year's worth of subscription to Superman, Action Comics, Justice League. And then that started, continuing to feed the obsession. And then once I had an income of my own, it just spiraled out of control from there.
Of course, as these things do. And I personally have to thank Tyler for my comic book obsession. We met in college, and he corrected me on something that I'd said, and then we became friends over that, and he took me to the comic book store, and I started reading comics, and I haven't looked back since. So thank you for that, Tyler. But at least I had someone who could point me in the direction of, hey, here are new books that are only like $3-4 a piece, not whatever the hell you probably had to pay saving up as a kid to get copies of The Death of Superman in individual issue form. So, bit of a difference in story, but hey, to each his own. Glad you got there. Well, I mean, that's a really cool way to get into it, is it having read some as a kid, not really having much of it for a while, and then coming back to it. Mine's kind of a similar story, different character, kind of a similar story. I think the first comic book I read, I always read the Sunday comics because those were fun and entertaining to me. But the first comic book proper that I read was Batman Mask of the Phantasm, because the VHS copy we'd gotten from a flea market felt a little heavier than it should when the VHS wasn't in it to child Andrew. And I opened it wide enough, and there was a copy of the comic that allegedly came with the movie originally tucked in the back of the VHS. Like, holy cow, this is cool. And I read it, and no idea where that thing is today. I wasn't smart and didn't keep it and frame it like you did. And I think I'd read like Calvin and Hobbes at another time in life, or we went to something and I got a book, The Big Book of Barry Ween, which was like this mad scientist kid, kind of like Dexter from Dexter's Lab, but a lot more adults in the way that he approached things. There's a lot of swearing in it, which was funny for teenage Andrew when I got a copy of that. But it wasn't until college when you and I connected, when you're like, hey, no, comic books are still a thing. Here they are. And I went, oh, wonderful. But, it's cool to hear that, your family kind of helped support that addiction and helped give you a little bit of that to enjoy. And honestly, comics really aren't the most expensive thing to give, especially in a yearly subscription for one book. It's 12 issues at $3 a pop. That's really not that bad as a birthday or Christmas gift. So yeah, it's a pretty good deal. That's a pretty good deal. So then what's been your favorite part of reading about Superman and just being a fan of Superman?
Oh man, that is such a broad question.
It is.
You know what it probably is because Superman is my favorite. I mean, he'll always be my favorite. I don't think anything will ever come by that will be able to top him. But because of the importance that he plays in the DC universe, because he is such an anchor, that means he crosses over with anyone and everyone that you can imagine.
Yeah.
And so by being a Superman fan and reading so much of his books consistently over years, I have been exposed to so many different characters and teams and writers and artists and, who knows what else that I probably would have never bothered to look into myself.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm talking my all-time favorite team of superheroes now, the Legion of Superheroes. I only know because obviously Superman interacted with them so closely. And, I remember when I first saw their title, when I was getting subscriptions back in the late 2000s, and Legion of Superheroes was one that was on there that you could pick from. And I was like, that sounds doofy. And then suddenly the Legion shows up in a Superman book, and I'm like, wait, these guys are actually cool. And now they're one of my all-time favorite teams. Well, they are my all-time favorite team. And I've got, their entire run collected from the 80s onwards. And in reading some of the older stories where he crosses over with characters like the Metal Men that I never would have bothered to look into before, or even just the way I'll call them the super family has expanded, right? I mean, you've got obviously his core supporting cast. You've got Lois, Jimmy, Perry White, and then his, staple of his rogues gallery. But then on top of that, you've got Superboy, you've got Steel, you've got Supergirl, you've got the Super Pets that are all part of it. And
Pets.
all of,
you want to. I know of one. I can guess at another, but go ahead. Tell us of the rest of the pets.
So we have obviously the best super pet and the original Krypto the Super Dog, who I'm sure is going to be the talk of the summer when the new movie eventually drops and everybody realizes what an amazing character he is, who has no flaws whatsoever, and you should all love Krypto. We also have, this one is primarily Supergirl's pet, but Streaky the Super Cat, who doesn't love a sweet cat? And then honestly, that just sounds terrible. I'm looking at my cat, who is just an absolute terror when she gets in the wrong mood. I can't imagine what she would be like with superpowers. That would be a nightmare.
Speaking of super pets and the new Superman movie with the trailer that I hope any one of our fans who hasn't seen that trailer yet, you need to go watch it. Have you, Tyler, seen the meme where instead of Krypto the Super Dog, it is a super cat, and Superman's lying there bloodied from whatever fight he is?
Yes.
And he's like trying to call the cat. The cat's just licking itself. And then
the cat just sits down and starts licking its butt.
Right. And then Superman dies because the cat's like, yeah, I don't care. I'm not doing anything to help you.
Yep. No, if that is not a cat, yeah.
Okay. So you like the diversity of the different characters that Superman gets to interact with.
I do. And there's two additional super pets that we didn't discuss.
Go ahead.
Did you know this?
Probably not. Go ahead.
So the other one is Comet the Super Horse.
Okay, I thought there was a horse. That was the one I was like, maybe this is real, but I don't think so.
Yeah. Oh yeah, totally real.
Comet
totally
the
real.
Super Horse. Okay.
And then the last one, one of the more interesting ones is you got Beppo the Super Monkey.
Super Monkey. Now, when did Beppo come into play?
I couldn't tell you the exact issue or year, but he was a Silver Age character for sure. Because Silver Age is when everything went off the rails, particularly Superman.
All right, a quick Google search here. Beppo the Super Monkey was in an issue of Superboy, number 76 in 1959. That was his first appearance. Wow.
Yep.
Okay. Did not know we had a Super Monkey. I knew the dog. I thought I knew the horse. So I'm glad you said that there was a horse and I wasn't just making that one up. Did know the cat, but like you said, that's more Supergirl's pet than it is Superman's pet.
Mm-hmm.
But wow.
Yeah, and believe it or not, I've actually got a Beppo the Super Monkey action figure. Yep, he came in a 2-pack with a Superman robot action figure, which was another Silver Age staple.
Okay. So you've talked a lot about, I mean, even just now you mentioned a bunch of different characters that are spawned off of Superman. Who's your favorite? Let's say Superman, DC finally gets to a point and they're like, you know what? We've written enough about Superman. I don't think they ever will. God, the day they do, you and I are both going to cry because that means Batman's next. But let's say Superman is done. No more Superman. And you get to pick who the next main super person is. Of all the different super beings that exist, who's taking Superman's place as the main super?
Ooh, that is a tough question. Well, I can tell you who my preference would be.
Well, yeah, I'm giving you the superpower, pun intended.
I like it. I like it.
Who's the next super?
If it is up to me, it's Connor Kent.
Connor Kent, and
he was the Superboy of the 90s.
Okay.
So the original Superboy, who is, I don't say him because he is just young Clark Kent.
Sure.
Right? The original tagline for Superboy was The Adventures of Superman when he was a boy. And then starting in the 80s, they did away with that and said Superman had no career in superheroics before his debut as Superman. And I love Clark Kent Superboy, but for the intent of this question, I don't feel like that's an appropriate answer because then my answer is just still Superman. But Connor Kent Superboy, so he actually debuted in the 90s as one of the 4 quote-unquote imposter Supermen that tried to fill the void that was left after the death of Superman storyline.
So is this one of those that you read in the trades after having read The Death of Superman?
Yes, it absolutely was.
So then,
at least
quick side
his original appearances.
Side question then, who are the other 3? We'll come back to why you like Superboy the best and why you want him the best, but who are the other 3?
Yep, so the other 3 is, the first one is Steel, John Henry Irons.
Yep.
So he is just, he's kind of like an Iron Man type character, right? He doesn't have any powers of his own, right? But he is an incredible genius of an engineer, and he designs this metal Superman suit that gives him strength, and he goes out and fights crime with a big old hammer. And it's a fun character. There's an absolutely horrendous movie starring Shaquille O'Neal that I absolutely recommend you avoid like the plague.
Well, now someone's gonna have to go look it up and just watch it. Yeah, exactly.
And then so he's the other one. And then number 3 is a character. Oh gosh. Well, yeah, it's an old story, so everything's gonna get spoiled eventually. This character is called the Eradicator eventually. And he is, believe it or not, he is actually like an AI that was in the ship that brought baby Clark to Earth. And with Superman gone, he, being Kryptonian in origin, he's got that DNA genetic makeup, and he takes the form. He actually looks the closest to Superman, and he goes in, and it's kind of that story where, like, it's a it's a computer that thinks it's human, but it's not, and is obviously kind of like immature and almost
Sure.
infantile in some ways, but
Sure.
it's got some of Superman's memories, and probably the most interesting of the four, to be honest. And then you have the fourth one, which is Hank Henshaw, the cyborg Superman.
Okay. Well, that sounds like an interesting read I need to add to my list sometime in the near future, because I've read The Death of Superman at some point in the past. I know I have, because I had to be friends with you. I think that was one of the requirements. But yeah, that sounds like something I probably need to read. I think they made an animated movie on that in the last 5-10 years or so.
I believe you're right. Yeah,
they did
called Reign of the
Superman.
Superman.
Yes, Reign of the Superman.
Because that was the title of that
art.
It was like a year plus, and it crossed over all of the Superman books, because there were 4 or 5 different titles. I can't remember if they had started the 5th one yet. I think they had, but yeah, it's from an era, my personal favorite era, called the Triangle Era, where they had 5 different books, and they all were just one seamless, continual story across all 5 of them.
That's quite a lot to keep up with. All right, so let's get back to it. You say Connor Kent is your favorite. What makes Connor Kent a good replacement for Superman? Again, not that I'm saying you need to give up Superman. This future fictitious world of, okay, no more Superman, who's going to take his place?
Yeah, so my reasons that I've always liked him is, well, one, I mean, if you've ever looked up a picture of him with that sweet leather jacket that isn't cringy at all, and he's covered in like the 90s pouches, and he's got a sick earring and a punk haircut, and he wears sunglasses inside because he's that cool. I mean, he is just he's the most 90s cool kid that you could possibly have, and I absolutely love it. But it's also really interesting because they made him a clone of Superman's DNA combined with Lex Luthor.
Okay.
He's actually a Luthor like scientific experiment that like broke out and went rogue.
Okay.
And so that provides like a really interesting backstory. There's a direct tie back to Superman, which I really like. He actually has powers. Unlike the others who they've got powers in their own right, but they don't come from Superman. They're inspired by Superman.
Sure.
He really is kind of like the closest you have to an actual succession from Superman.
Kind of makes sense. Okay. So then, along the same lines but slightly different question, I've got to assume, knowing that there are a multiverse of comics out there, what's your favorite version of Superman?
My favorite incarnation of Superman is going to be the early post-crisis. And I will fully admit that I have the nostalgic goggles on 100%. But the John Byrne, Dan Jurgens Superman era is without a doubt my favorite. It's what I've read the most of. It's to me, it's when you say the word Superman, that's the incarnation of the character that pops into my head.
What years are that? I'm guessing.
So it's really like
post-crisis.
Yeah, so the crisis happened in 86, and I believe Jurgens was on the book until 97, 98 maybe.
Okay.
So it's the back half of the 80s and then pretty much all through the 90s.
Okay. All right. Because I know, Batman's changed a few times since his initial inception. All the different cartoons and the different movies and even the live action movies, each one's a different version of the character. But even within the comic books, there are so many different versions of Batman. So I just wanted to know, what's your favorite pick of Superman across all those? And it sounds like it's the canonically accurate, is in the timeline, is the real Superman, but it was by those specific author and artists in the late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and like I
Is that
said,
with the
there's
mullet and everything that Superman had at the
that does include the mullet years. Yep, sure does.
I kind of had to assume it was because of the time frame. So okay, well
Yep.
that's cool. Cool.
Yeah,
What
I've always been a big time fan of the mainline canonical Superman. Um, I really like a lot of the uh oh gosh, blanking on his name, Neil Adams, the Neil Adams Superman from the 70s.
right?
That's another. It was the mainline canonical Superman at the time.
Yep.
You have to go into it knowing that the writing conventions of the 70s are not the same as they were in the 90s or today. So,
Yes.
don't necessarily go in with that expectation. But if you want, some fun classic Superman stories that aren't quite as ridiculous as you get in the Golden Age or Silver Age, the Neil Adams years I would highly recommend those as well. And then, obviously the Jeff Johns runs in the 2000s are some of the greatest stories that we ever got.
Well, I think most nerds will agree that, especially comic book nerds who know the name Jeff Johns, any comic book that he touches turns to gold for quite a while. For as long as he's writing on it, at least. I mean, he's the one who helped revitalize even the Green Lantern, didn't he?
Yep. He wrote
Did the whole Rebirth and then led
yeah.
into the War of Light and all of that good stuff that came from it.
Yep, sure did.
Yeah, no, that's if you don't know who Jeff Johns is, that's a good person to look up and pick your favorite superhero. And if he's touched it, great, read whatever he's written on them. So that's kind of a good segue into one of the next questions I wanted to ask you. What are some recommended readings you have? So obviously you've mentioned the Jeff Johns stuff. Your favorite stuff, the best stuff according to you, is going to be by the guys who wrote him from the late 80s to the early 90s. What else do you recommend?
Yeah, so I've got a bunch. If you want something that is a little more modern, there's several different origin stories that have been done that are all really well done that I would highly recommend. You mentioned, or I mentioned, I guess, we were just talking about Jeff Johns. He wrote one for Superman called Secret Origins that is really, really good. For a while, that was the kind of considered like the definitive Superman origin story. It was after the Infinite Crisis, and it established what his new fully canonical origin was. So that's a good one. I think of these three origin stories that I'm about to name, it's actually the weakest, because I prefer more than that one is another one called Birthright. I thought that one was really, really good. It does a great job of capturing the essence of the character and the Kents and showing how he makes that transition from Clark Kent with superpowers to Superman. Really like that. And then the best one, what to me is like, if you know nothing at all about Superman, or if you just want what is the best absolute place to start with Superman comic books, it's a 4-part miniseries called Superman for All Seasons. And it once again is a retelling of his origin, but it to me really captures the entire essence of what makes Superman Superman, and it does it better than anything else.
Okay. Well, one that you've made me read, I say made, it didn't take much for you to say, hey, Andrew, this is a great book, read it. Superman from Earth 1. There's a whole series of those. What are your thoughts on that one? Because I like it. I'm not the biggest Superman fan, but I think that's a pretty good, very modern retelling of Superman / Clark Kent trying to find his way in the world. Just because it shows him as the intelligent person he is, as the caring person he is, not really knowing where to fit in. And if any of you have ever watched a little bitty movie called Man of Steel, you've almost kind of read the book of Superman Earth 1. They are very, very similar in showing Clark trying to bounce from job to job to job, trying to figure out where he wants to be in this world, and then eventually finding his place as like, okay, well, I need to be the superhero who saves the day. Does it make your recommended list? That's going to make my recommendation list for Superman, because that's a good one.
It does. It does. And the reason being is I think it appeals to a wide audience. If we're talking my personal preferences, it's a little more angsty teenager than I like in my Superman, if I'm being totally honest.
That's
But
fair.
that doesn't make it a bad story.
No,
That doesn't make it
no.
a bad Superman story.
No, and I will concede that it doesn't have him as, it's not as much as him being the Boy Scout that you love and that you keep coming back to Superman for. And I'll agree, that's no Boy Scout in that book.
Yeah.
I will say he does kind of grow into that a little bit more through volumes 2 and volume 3 of that series. He doesn't become the perfect Superman who's always smiling and always happy. This is still a very young Superman. This is kind of, you mentioned Smallville earlier, and I know that ends with him sort of wearing the suit for the first time, kind of officially becoming Superman, because the whole premise of Smallville was no tights, no flights.
No tights, no flights.
They're trying to keep him grounded, trying to like show him as the Blur so that nobody knows, oh, this is Superman. Well, okay, we all know who this actually is. We know what's coming. It just had to build up to that point. The Earth 1 Superman kind of feels like it's taking place, obviously not in the same universe, but just kind of right after that, where he knows that he can do these things. He has the suit to be able to. He just has to find his place in the world.
Yeah.
And
yeah, it's a really good retelling for, I think they nailed it for the audience that they wanted to capture.
Yeah.
Which was the younger kids who don't currently read comics, who need a reason to get in and try it. So, recognizing that that's what they were trying to do, I think they nailed it.
Right.
For me, as a longtime Superman fan, it's not my favorite, but hey, I read it. I liked it. I liked it enough to recommend it to you. So, yeah, that's certainly, if that's the version of the character that you want, by all means, it's a great place to start. It's a great read. For one that is very modern, like within the last 3-4 years, that's a ton of fun, and to me, still really captures that classic essence of the character. Superman Smashes the Klan.
Superman Smashes the Klan. Okay.
And that is a great one, especially in the modern world that we live in with, situations and things. It just really plays into what it means to be the good guy who isn't going to stand up for anything other than doing what's right.
Sure.
And it's a really good read, extremely well written. The art might be a little more cartoony than some people would like. But I don't feel like that diminishes from the story at all in any way, shape, or form. It really fits the tone that they're going with.
Good.
And the story that they're telling. So highly recommend that if you want something a little more modern, that doesn't require a whole lot of extra context and background reading like some of the stories from the mainline books.
Right. Okay. And then real quick, what's your favorite Superman movie?
My favorite Superman movie is the original Superman the movie with
Superman the movie. Fun fact here. I do know this because I'm a bit of a movie guy. The new Superman movie was going to be called something like Superman Next Generation or some.
I think it was Superman Legacy.
Superman Legacy. It is now officially just Superman, because the first one, the one you mentioned, is called Superman: the movie. Everyone just refers to it as Superman, and you're like, oh yeah, it's that Superman movie, the original one with Christopher Reeves. Everyone loves it. But that one's official name is Superman the movie. Now, Superman Legacy is just going to be called Superman, because there isn't a movie just called Superman, which is kind of cool.
I know. How crazy is it that he's almost 100 years old and there's never been a movie called just Superman?
Just Superman, yep. Batman has one. It's called Batman.
He does.
We'll get into that another time.
We just need the video game.
That's a whole nother subject on how do we do a good Superman video game. I'm sure you've got ideas, and that sounds like a great topic for another time. But But something I did want to talk about is, where is Superman in the world of comics? And obviously he's still, like you said, he's a pop culture icon. Everyone knows that red, blue, and yellow of his emblem, and they know who he is and usually what he stands for. And there's been several different versions of him. But I obviously didn't go out and poll people. I just went to a website called ranker.com and looked at their list of the top 100 superheroes. And it is ranked by most comic book appearances. Okay, so it says 100 most popular superheroes and villains. The official ranking is how many times they've appeared in an issue of a comic book.
Interesting.
Okay, where do you think Superman ranks?
You know what? I'm going to say it number one.
You're going to say number one.
I'm going to say number one.
You're wrong. And I hate to tell you that. Sorry.
Man, who's number one?
Batman.
Ugh.
Even with your 5 books a month that you had for a while there, it's not Superman. Batman has 14,358 issues as of the writing of this article in October of 2024. Superman has 13,164 issues. So 1,000 issues more of Batman's appearance. And I think that, again, a different subject. I know you're not happy. I'm sorry. That doesn't mean Superman's a worse character. That doesn't mean Superman's not the most popular. Granted, Superman didn't have a number 1 selling book last year, but that's for other reasons. But it still shows just how powerful Superman and, by extension, Batman are, because the next most popular one is Wolverine at 12,912 comics. So he's not far behind Superman, but honestly, if you ask the average person to name a superhero, okay, Batman, Superman, Wolverine, Spider-Man Captain America are going to be your top ones. That's the list of the top 5 appearances of books, of characters in books, okay? And that's pretty telling, because those are, in my humble opinion, those are the most popular characters I would expect from comic books as a whole. Now, whether or not they're your favorite, but those are damn popular ones.
Yes, they are.
So it's cool to see that there are 13,000 instances or issues in which Superman has made an appearance in not even 100 years. That's insane to think about. It's just insane. But so I'm gonna go with one more question for you, and this can be a long or a short answer. Your call here. Where do you see Superman heading in the coming years? Based on where he is today in modern nerd culture, he's getting a new movie coming out. He's got some good comic books in circulation right now. Seems like everything's going pretty well. He's got an anime. There's a Lois and Clark TV show out for him right now.
Just recently ended.
Oh, did it just end?
Yeah.
Well, I guess I'm going to just go have to binge watch the whole thing. But still, he had a Lois and Clark TV show. He's been in pop culture for quite a while. Where do you see him heading in the next 10, 15 years?
I really, and part of this is optimism, that I think especially with this new movie, things are really going to expand for him. He's going to get cemented again in that, that cultural zeitgeist. And I think we're going to see a lot more Superman coming. Maybe not Superman specifically, but at least Superman adjacent.
Okay.
We had a Supergirl TV series, and we've got a Supergirl movie coming.
It's true.
I wouldn't be surprised if we see expanding into Superboy or Steel with his daughter, who is now also a superhero in her own right. Okay. We had the Krypton TV series, which I think that only went for 2 seasons, but there's a lot of untapped opportunity out there, and they're exploring a lot of that in the comic books and stuff like that. But with this new movie, I think it's really going to open up the door for a lot of new material, a lot of new media, and a lot of new opportunity that I hope they take a lot of advantage of.
Cool. Excellent. I mean, that would be good. Not that I don't think Superman's doing well. Like I said, he's, based on this rank, 13,000 issues of him appearing is a pretty good standing to have. But I think you're right, and I would agree that, for one, I trust the team that's behind this movie. I think it's going to be a really well done movie. I mean, I personally love Man of Steel. I know you have your qualms with it, but it was a good movie. I think this one's going to be much better. And I think, like you said, this has a potential to really cement Superman as a current pop culture icon, and keep him popular in the nerd culture. And I know that they've done a lot to say, here are the books that we're referencing. So, if you don't like Tyler's recommendations, which I'm sure they're fine, but if you don't like his recommendations, there are other recommendations out there based on this movie that's coming up that you could read. I don't have.
Oh, and I've got tons more too.
Oh, I'm sure you do. We don't have time for them today, but no, I agree with you. This new movie and what they've done with him recently should help to cement Superman for even longer in years to come. I mean, there's even on this list here, one of the other lists that it ranks him in is comic book characters who could put Homelander from The Boys in his place. You want to take a wild guess at where they put Superman on that list?
I would hope number one.
He's number one. He is 100% number one of the other comic book characters who could put Homelander in his place.
Good.
So,
as he should be.
Okay, well, Tyler, I think we're running out of time for today. Aww. It's been fun. I've enjoyed learning a little bit more about Superman, and your love for Superman always amazes me. Any last thoughts you want to leave these people with? Any final nuggets of information that you could give them to make them believe that Superman is the best superhero?
Oh man, you would end it with a really hard one.
That's not a hard one. It's easy. You say because he is. He's the best superhero. What more is there to say?
Yeah. Superman is the best. Any other opinion is wrong.
That's the nerd that I know. Well, Tyler, thank you for spending time with me today. Thank you for talking through Superman. And we hope to have you back sometime soon to talk through other nerdy topics.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And that wraps up the first episode of Two Nerds vs. the Internet. We'd love to hear from you, so please leave a comment on this podcast and know that we are trying to get it shared to other sites. Please hit us up on Instagram at 2NVI Podcast. And if you enjoyed this show, please send it to a friend who would also enjoy it so that we can help launch this into the next wave of what it is. Until then, take care and keep nerding out.